On the evening of the 1st of May 1993, patrons gathered at the Highgate Hotel bar, a popular drinking hole in East London. One of the patrons was 35-year-old Carl Webber, who was enjoying a drink with his friend Douglas Gates. They were accompanied by Carl's colleagues, Megan Boucher and Doreen Rousseau. It was a Saturday night, so the place was busy. 20-year-old Neville Belling and his cousin Roland Parker were driving around town looking for a place with a vibe, so they finally decided to head to the Highgate. When they arrived, they took a seat and ordered their drinks. Suddenly, soon after 10 p.m, gunmen wearing balaclavas and armed with AK-47 assault rifles and grenades entered the Highgate Hotel bar and opened fire, leaving 5 people dead and 7 seriously injured. The Highgate Hotel Massacre was part of a long list of bloody episodes that took place in the turbulent years leading up to South Africa's first ever democratic elections. More than 30 years later, and despite an exhaustive police investigation, no arrests were ever made. So who was responsible for this horrific terrorist attack? How's it? My name is Dr. Jacobus Seynert. You're watching The Historian's Stash, and this is the story of the Highgate Hotel Massacre. Now, to understand why the Highgate Hotel Massacre took place, it's important to understand what else was going on at the time. In February 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and the African National Congress, or the ANC, and other liberation movements, including the Pan-Africanist Congress, or the PAC, were unbanned. For the next year, so-called bilateral talks about talks between the ANC and the National Party government established the preconditions for substantive negotiations. But in March 1990, police opened fire on more than 500 anti-apartheid protesters in the township of Sebokeng, near Johannesburg, killing at least 14 people and wounding more than 380. This caused the ANC to interrupt the talks. In response, then President F.W. de Klerk ordered an investigation of the Sebokeng massacre. This leads to the establishment of the Goldstone Commission of Inquiry regarding the prevention of public violence and intimidation. Eventually, the ANC returned to the negotiating table, and in 1991, the National Peace Accord was signed. This was consolidated later that year by the establishment of the Multi-Party Convention for a Democratic South Africa, or CODESA. However, opposition to the negotiations is strong. Extremist white supremacy groups gain a lot of support. The majority of white people, though, had had enough of the growing political violence and sanctions that were debilitating the economy. So, in a calculating move, the moderates within the South African government pushed to hold a referendum. On the 17th of March 1992, white South African voters went to the polls to decide if apartheid should end. A solid majority of 69% voted yes, with only 31% voting no. This demonstrated to the government, to the liberation movements, as well as to the rest of the world, that white South Africans believed that apartheid was untenable and were asking the government to dismantle it completely. But 2 months later, the CODESA negotiations reached a deadlock. As a result, the ANC returns to a program of mass action, hoping to leverage its popular support. Then, on the 17th of June 1992, the township of Boipatong near Vanderbijl Park is attacked by supposed supporters of the Inkatha Freedom Party, or the IFP, a Zulu nationalist movement and rival to the ANC. 45 people are killed and dozens more are maimed. Rumors circulate that government agents supplied weapons to the IFP and had even participated in the attack. But these rumors seem baseless, because why would the government want to fuel violence if they wanted to negotiate a peaceful transition? Well, the theory goes that there were still people within government who were skeptical about a transition to black majority rule. And because the ANC was the key player in realizing this transition, these elements, the so-called third force, sought to destabilize negotiations. If it came to light that the government or elements within government were trying to derail the negotiations, then the outside world would have no sympathy for the whole white minority if civil war broke out. But if the ANC backed out of negotiations, then the government would be seen as the party seeking peace, while the ANC would be viewed as the obstinate aggressor. Now, whether or not you agree with this theory, if there was a third force, their plan was most certainly working. Following the Boipatong massacre, the ANC withdrew from negotiations entirely. Indeed, political violence was nearly continuous throughout the negotiations. There were regular clashes between supporters of the ANC and supporters of the IFP, and violence broke out in the homelands as homeland leaders were desperate not to be reincorporated back into South Africa. All of this threatened to derail the negotiations completely. Fortunately, bilateral talks continued, and this eventually led to a new record of understanding signed between the ANC and the government in September 1992, which paved the way for the multi-party negotiating forum of April to November 1993, which would ultimately lead to the decision to hold the first free and fair democratic elections on the 27th of April 1994. But despite renewed negotiations and hope for a peaceful transition, violence continued, and eventually it reached a tipping point. On the 10th of April 1993, the popular General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Chris Hani, was gunned down outside his house by right-wing extremist Janusz Walus. After the assassination, racially fueled riots broke out in Cape Town, Durban, and Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha today. This caused mass chaos and disruption across South Africa. It looked like this would be the straw that broke the camel's back, plunging the country into civil war. But it didn't. Mandela, though not president yet, addressed the nation on the 14th of April to call for peace. This and the agreement on a date for the country's first democratic elections helped to lessen tensions. But there were still elements from across the political spectrum who still wanted to disrupt these elections at all costs. As I mentioned earlier, there were those within the nationalist government as well as white extremist groups who were hell-bent to disrupt the transition. Then there were the Zulu nationalist Inkatha, who saw the ANC as ethnic and political rivals, poaching their supporters and reducing their power. And then you had the Pan-Africanist Congress, or the PAC, and its military wing, the Zanian People's Liberation Army, or APRA, formerly known as POCO. After 1986, APRA adopted the rallying cry of "One settler, one bullet." In 1991, it launched Operation Great Storm, a violent paramilitary campaign aimed at white farmers in an attempt to obtain weapons and funding. Initially, APRA attacked and robbed farms in the Free State and Eastern Cape, resulting in a number of farm murders. But then, attacks later expanded to urban civilian targets. On the 28th of November 1992, 4 APRA operatives struck the King Williamstown Golf Club. They entered the club while a group of friends were enjoying an end-of-year function and opened fire on the group with automatic weapons. 4 people were killed and 56 others were injured. APRA's chief commander, Sabelo Palmer, confirmed that he had sanctioned the attack. Then on the 5th and 7th of April 1993, a couple of days before Hani's assassination, Palmer appeared in an interview on SABC declaring that he would aim his guns at children to hurt whites where it hurts most. Less than a month later, the attack on the Highgate Hotel took place. At the subsequent Truth and Reconciliation Commission or TRC hearing held 3 years after the attack, Neville Billing remembered that on the evening of the 1st of May 1993, he and his cousin, Roland Parker, arrived at the Highgate and went to the men's bar area. He recalled, "On our arrival, we immediately entered the bar and took up seating at the bar counter near the doorway to the pool room. We then ordered beers from the bartender, and shortly after our drinks had arrived, I suddenly heard the sound of running footsteps approaching the entrance. There was a lot of noise that accompanied the footsteps, almost as if a bar fight had broken out outside. So Neville turned to his right and looked towards the bar entrance to see what was going on. Just at that moment, he saw what he described as a black male appearing in the doorway. Neville described this person wearing black trousers, white shirt, and a brownish colored jacket, as well as a balaclava. The man was brandishing a rifle, but Neville didn't have time to identify the rifle make. The man pointed the barrel of the weapon towards Neville and Roland and opened fire. Neville dove to his left in an attempt to pull Roland to the ground. They both fell backwards from their bar stool and hit the floor hard. By the time he had hit the floor, Neville could feel that he had been hit by the gunfire. At this point, he could still hear the man open fire into the bar, and then suddenly he heard a loud explosion as a grenade was lobbed into the bar. The explosion rocked the entire bar as the gunmen continued to spray the bar area with bullets. Shortly after the explosion, Neville heard something roll on the floor behind him. Fearing that it was another grenade, he braced himself for the explosion. The grenade went off, but it turned out that it was a tear gas canister that had been set off. The shooting then suddenly stopped. At this point, Neville was choking on the tear gas. The lights had been blasted out by the explosion, so the bar was completely dark. It was absolute chaos, followed by a deafening silence. Meanwhile, in the ladies' bar, Carl, Douglas, Megan, and Doreen had just ordered their first drinks when they heard what sounded like crackers going off from the men's bar. A while later, they heard a massive bang. Someone shouted that they were under attack. Carl would later recall what happened next. We then realized that we were under attack, but before any of us could fall down or take cover, this guy was standing by the entrance door. Carl described the man wearing a balaclava, a bluish overall, and gloves. But what caught his eyes was that the man wore blue police combat boots. Carl was about 5 meters away from the man and could clearly see that he had an AK-47 on his hip. Carl dropped down to the ground instinctively, but before he could hit the floor, the man opened fire into the pub. When Carl was on the floor, he could see the man still standing in the doorway, swinging the firearm around and spraying bullets everywhere. Carl would later testify that it seemed like the magazines were taped together because the man just kept firing, pausing briefly and then carrying on. For Carl, it felt like an eternity. It was later entered into evidence that 56 bullet casings were found in the ladies' bar, with an additional 17 found elsewhere. A normal AK-47 magazine can only hold a maximum of 30 to 40 rounds. While he was on the ground, Carl could smell blood everywhere from the people who were lying all around him. He turned towards his friends and saw that Doreen was lying next to him. She had a massive bullet wound in her left leg, so in an attempt to stop the bleeding, Carl stuck his elbow into the wound. He was still lying on the ground treating Doreen when he heard something rolling towards him. A few seconds later, it exploded, but instead of shrapnel fragments flying across the room, tear gas filled the air all around him. At this point, he could see the gunman still standing at the door, continuing to spray the room with automatic rifle fire. Carl said at that moment he began to pray and lost all track of time. A few seconds passed when the severity of the situation dawned upon him that people had been killed. He opened his eyes just in time to see how the gunman slung his weapon over his shoulder before leaving the bar. Carl still lay on the ground, unable to move and unable to breathe because of the tear gas. Meanwhile, in the men's bar, when the shooting ceased, Neville called out to Roland but heard no response. Fearing that Roland was dead, Neville knew that he had to get out of the bar and get help. He tried to get up, but couldn't because his whole left side was numb. Each time he attempted to get up, he fell down because he was slipping in his own blood. He eventually managed to lean over Roland's body and reached for the bar counter to pull himself up. He needed to get help, but was too afraid to go out the door because the gunman could still be outside. So he struggled toward a back exit where he saw another survivor on their haunches. Neville reached the hotel conference room, but by this time he was overwhelmed by pain and collapsed. A few minutes passed, and then he heard a familiar voice calling out to him. It was Roland. It turned out that when Neville had pulled him from the bar stool, Roland had knocked his head and briefly lost consciousness. When he came to, he ran out into the street where he saw someone shoot a revolver in his direction. Roland then ran back into the hotel and heard Neville's voice and ran over to him. Carl was still lying on the bloody floor when two men who lived close by came in and found him. He told them that he couldn't move and asked them to remove his clothes so that first responders could easily find his wounds. It wasn't long before first responders arrived, but they weren't prepared for the horrors they found inside the Highgate. There were bodies lying everywhere. Some were alive, but there were others who were lying lifeless on the ground. Bar stools were overturned, and the floor in both bars was littered with spent bullet casings and pools of blood. Paramedics found Neville and Roland at the back exit and quickly evacuated them to hospital. Doctors told Neville that he'd been shot in his left arm and hip as well as in the back. He needed urgent surgery. He pleaded with them to save his life before passing out. When he woke up 3 days later, a doctor told him that he was going to be in and out of hospital for the next 30 years. This turned out to be very accurate. Carl was also taken to hospital and passed out shortly after arrival. He woke up about 4 days later and was told that he had been shot in both arms. One bullet had passed through his right arm, causing him to only have partial use of it. Another bullet had pierced his left arm just below the elbow. Unfortunately, doctors couldn't save that arm and had to amputate it at the elbow. Carl was also informed that his friend Douglas Gates had died. 4 others also died that night. One of them was Dion Harris, who was out celebrating the prospect of becoming an uncle on his birthday. While at the bar, Dion had met a man who had just had his first child. So they chatted about kids. When they were finished chatting, the man was on his way home, but Dion called him back to swap phone numbers. It was at this moment when the attack took place. Dion was killed, but the man just happened to be armed and he returned fire, cutting the attack short. Dion is often credited with inadvertently saving lives, because if he hadn't called the man back, there would have been no one to defend the survivors. 7 people, including Carl, Neville, Megan and Doreen, were wounded. An extensive police investigation was launched to find those responsible for the attack. Suspicions immediately fell on Upla, who were likely suspects. Captain Daryl Else, head of the murder and robbery unit for the border region, was tasked with investigating the case. He was part of a national task team set up to investigate attacks linked to Upla in the run-up to the 1994 election. These attacks included the King Williamstown Golf Club attack, as well as the St. James Massacre, where Upla operatives fired into a church in Kenilworth, Cape Town, and killed 11 congregation members while injuring 58 others. And then also the Heidelberg Tavern attack, where 3 APRA operatives gunned down 4 people at a popular student hangout. These last 2 attacks occurred after the Highgate Hotel massacre. Captain Els was adamant that if it was APRA who perpetrated this attack, he would catch those responsible. But during his investigation, he noticed inconsistencies. According to him, APRA was usually very quick to claim responsibility for an attack, even if they weren't responsible. But in this instance, they never came forward. PAC leader Letlapa Mpasela said that the first time he heard about the attack was when he read about it in the newspaper the next morning. He agreed with Captain Els that APRA freely admitted involvement in attacks, even if they didn't perpetrate them, because they wanted to boost their credentials as a liberation movement. But strangely, no one in the organization claimed responsibility or even knew about Highgate. Another inconsistency, according to Captain Els, was that the Highgate attackers wore black or dark blue uniforms and balaclavas and used AK-47s, a hand grenade and tear gas. But APRA often used R1s, R4s and R5s stolen from farms or from weapons depots of the Ciskei and Transkei Defence Forces because they couldn't get ammunition for AK-47s. Thirdly, Captain Els stated that APRA never withdrew under tear gas, as was done at Highgate. He added that the Highgate attackers had better training and far greater accuracy in shooting than in other APRA attacks. Fourthly, witnesses pointed out that some of the attackers had black face paint under their balaclavas. APRA also usually used hijacked vehicles in attacks and would later be found abandoned. But in this case, no vehicles were reported stolen or hijacked in East London before the attack, and the getaway vehicle was never found. APRA often reused their weapons, meaning that police could connect their attacks through ballistics testing. But according to Captain Els, the AK-47s used at Highgate were never linked ballistically before or after that attack to anything else. This shows that they were used specifically for that attack and were then most probably destroyed. Another key aspect was that back then, sharing of intelligence between the police and other security forces was routine and actually vital in solving and preventing terrorist attacks. However, there was no intelligence leading up to or after the attack. This meant that either none of the other branches of the security forces knew anything about who may have perpetrated the attack, or there was a deliberate withholding of intelligence. Finally, APRA documented all its attacks, and these documents were stored in APRA headquarters in Mthatha and Lesotho. But when these documents were seized in 1994 and 1995 respectively, there was no mention of the Highgate attack. So if it wasn't APRA, then who was responsible for the attack? Well, a couple of years ago, a neighbor of mine, who I shall not name out of safety concerns, told me the story of the Highgate massacre and asked me to look into it for a potential article. He told me that it had been accepted by the police and the public that APRA was responsible. But he also told me that he was told by reliable sources that the attack was in fact planned and carried out by third force elements from within the South African military. He told me that he was told that a special forces unit called the Hammer Unit, also known as the Eastern Cape Elimination Squad, perpetrated the attack. Wait, what now? Not a lot is known about this unit. I pride myself on having a decent knowledge of old SADF units, but I had never heard of this one. I then scoured the internet for more information, but very little, if anything, is written about the Hammers. I came across a SADF veteran website which stated that the Hammer unit was established by Brigadier CP Joffel van der Westhuizen towards the end of 1983 as a Special Forces unit to be used for bona fide military operations. That's literally all that's written about them. But then I did some further digging and came across an article written back in 1992 about the Hammer unit's unwanted exposure in the press after being implicated in the murders of anti-apartheid activists Matthew Goniwe, Fort Kalata, Sparrow Mkonto, and Sicelo Mhloli, also known as the Cradock Fall, on the 27th of June 1985. The article further described the unit as engaging in unorthodox practices outside of normal military oversight, and is an example of a third force unit gone out of control. So could a rogue unit of the SADF be responsible for the Highgate Hotel massacre? Well, initially I wasn't convinced. It's one thing for apartheid security forces to instigate black-on-black violence and murder anti-apartheid activists, but having a Special Forces elimination squad kill fellow white South Africans as part of a major false flag operation is something else entirely. But then I remembered another mysterious case that occurred shortly after the 1994 elections. On the 23rd of May 1994, the bodies of Scott Ayton and Felix Coetzee were discovered in the Ayton family home in Port Elizabeth. Both men had been killed execution style, and police investigators at the time remarked that the assassins were well trained and careful not to leave any trace. The detectives were convinced that the two men were assassinated because they either knew too much or found out too much about a sensitive issue. But nothing conclusive could be proven. Eventually, the case went cold, and like the Highgate Hotel attack, remains unsolved. But in the years following the Ayton Coetzee murders, various sources from the intelligence community revealed bits of information that suggest that the two men were killed as part of an operation by the infamous Civil Cooperation Bureau, or CCB, to tie up loose ends. It came out that Scott had been a technician for DECA, a secret surveillance unit for the SADF, and he had close ties to Corrie Goosen, who was one of the CCB's most notorious assassins. It's alleged that Scott was involved with the CCB in a covert operation during early 1994 to smuggle South African weapons aboard ships at Port Elizabeth Harbour, which was then transported to a rogue country. So, if these credible sources from within the South African intelligence community are to be believed, apartheid security forces were very capable of killing their own people. For years, Captain Els remained adamant that there was a massive police cover-up in the investigation of the Highgate Hotel massacre. He claimed that he was prevented from investigating high-ranking members of the Hammer unit. As a result, it was one of the few cases he could never solve. If a third force was involved, as he suspected, then the implications would be greater than anyone could imagine. Captain Els and his colleagues in the police tried to disclose their belief in the third force attackers at the TRC hearings, but they were told that it could not be accepted without concrete evidence. He later joined the Directorate of Special Operations, or Scorpions, in 1999, and eventually retired from the police in 2007. During his retirement, he became a private investigator. During this time, he partnered up with another PI, Frans Mullerkom, to assist with uncovering the truth on behalf of the survivors and families of the victims of Highgate. During this investigation, Els and Mullerkom managed to meet with a former member of the Hammer unit. In a startling turn of events, this member alleged that the unit was indeed involved in the massacre. The member explained that 6 men from Hammer were involved, and actually identified himself as the driver of the getaway vehicle, while the unit's commander led the attack. This was massive information. It looked like Captain Els was finally getting an admission of guilt from someone within the Hammer unit itself. But without sworn statements and concrete evidence, it seemed as if yet another chance to expose the truth behind the attack had been lost. Then, on the 27th of January 2025, after more than 3 decades, an inquest into the massacre began at the East London Special Tribunal. The inquest aimed to uncover new evidence, identify potential suspects, and understand why the case has remained unresolved for so long. It's a crucial step towards accountability, and it's one final chance for survivors and families of the deceased to find justice and closure. As of the recording of this video, no finding has been made yet by the Special Tribunal. I will keep you updated on any findings made by the Special Tribunal. So please subscribe to the Historian Stash and like and comment on this video so that you can get these updates first. Also, if you've heard of any other theory or wish to share something interesting about an aspect of what I've discussed in this episode, then please drop it below in the comments. The last 4 years of apartheid will be remembered as a turbulent time in our history. Yes, euphoria and excitement gripped the country following the release of Nelson Mandela. There was a sense of hope with the dawn of a new democratic South Africa. But at the same time, fear and uncertainty threatened to snuff out that hope. We can't forget how close we came to being plunged into a full-scale civil war. And we can't forget the elements from both sides that sought to willfully push us to that brink. Lastly, we must never forget the victims of these elements. South Africans from all races and backgrounds who paid with their lives for free South Africa. As the inquest unfolds, I really hope that it will shed some light on this dark period of our country's history and offer comfort and solace to the survivors and their families, as well as the families of the slain. That's it for now. Thank you for watching the Historian Stash. Until next time, stay stashy.